you very much. Right, there may still be one or two more people to come down, but we'll kind of make a start slowly then in terms of the session this morning. One of the things I wanted to say before we started was, again, thank you for submitting the assignments that have come in so far. I know one or two people still have extensions with those. My aim would be at the start of the session next week to spend about 10 minutes potentially going through and giving you some kind of general feedback in terms of what's come out of those assignments so far. I'm quite conscious really that the date for the return of the feedback is the 5th of December, and then your second assignment comes in the Friday after, so that doesn't give you much time to potentially look through and take on board any specific feedback. So there is nothing major, I would say, that I've seen in any of the assignments I've read through so far, but I will go through and see if there are any kind of general points that might be worth noting. One of the things that kind of come out, which is a standard thing that kind of come out, I suppose, is looking at things like how people have cited and referenced sources they've used, for example. So we might spend a couple of moments going through that. And then I'll pick up on any kind of good points that have come through, and then potentially areas to develop in terms of those as well. So hopefully there might be something that's helpful in terms of that. But the recognition by the time we get to next Friday, I won't have gone through and read everything by that point. And maybe some of what I say might not be relevant to you when you look back at your assignment. Okay. So what are we going to look at today then? So what we're going to do, we're going to carry on really with the topic we started looking at last week, which is thinking about different areas of additional learning need. And what we focused on last week was that cognition and learning area of need. So those learners who found it a challenge for whatever reason to learn at the same pace or in the same way as peers of the same age. And then we kind of drilled down to say that there were different types of cognition and learning needs. And we focused on one which is probably one of the best known, but one which is incredibly misunderstood, and there are all sorts of myths and misconceptions about. And as we said last time, we can't agree, for example, on whether dyslexia exists or not. If it does, what causes it? Should we label learners with dyslexia? Is that helpful or not? And what impact those kind of things might have. So we're going to kind of pick up on that and take that forward a little bit more this week. And the aim of doing that really is to kind of talk through an example which could fit very well one of these second coursework choices, which is the impact of labels. Now, we've talked about the impact of labels before generally. If you decide to choose that one, for example, you might decide to pick one of the labels we look at today and use that more specifically. So I'm going to kind of talk through pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages of that label, as that might be a useful one to use in that assignment. Or potentially you might not be that interested in dyslexia and you might decide to look at another label, but it gives you a similar kind of format to work through. And then what we're also going to think a little bit about today as well. So we said last week dyslexia was an impact in terms of literacy. Now there's all sorts of things involved in literacy. There's reading, writing, spelling, but there's also speaking and listening and oracy as well. So we'll think a little bit about how children kind of commonly develop those literacy skills and think about then why dyslexia might be challenging in terms of those. So in particular today, we're going to focus a little bit on children's development of spelling. We're going to think a little bit about what we're doing when we're reading. And then those of you that are able to make the seminars tomorrow, what we're going to focus on a little bit more is practical strategies to support learners. So if you happen to be working with a learner who struggles with spelling, what are some of the different strategies that can be useful as an example to support that? Okay, so a little bit more kind of theoretical today, a little bit more practical in terms of offering support tomorrow. So last week then, as a recap, we said then that all learners in Wales who were categorised as having an additional learning need, their needs can be put into one of these 4 different boxes or categories. And it's also worth remembering that a learner with additional learning needs might have a need that just links to one. So they might specifically have a cognition and learning need. But equally, they might have needs across 2, 3 or 4 of these boxes as well. And potentially the kind of primary area of need, the main challenge they face might impact upon and lead to others areas of need. So that learner who is autistic, for example, and is experiencing sensory overload in a classroom, that we'll think about in more detail next week, that might lead on to things like emotional or mental health challenges or school anxiety, for example. So in terms of these 4 broad areas, then communication and interaction we'll focus on next week when we think about autism, but we looked at the fact that the most common area of need identified in Wales, especially in primary school age children, with speech and language challenges. Cognition and learning that we're recapping and building on today, so those children who learn at a different pace or in a different way to others of the same age. Social, emotional and mental health difficulties. Okay, so quite a broad category here. So we could include ADHD, we could include anxiety, we could include eating disorders, we could include substance misuse, for example. We could be thinking about the impacts of trauma that many of you talked about previously. And the final one, sensory and or physical needs. So hearing impairment, physical impairment, visual impairment, combinations of all of those things. Okay. So cognition and learning, and as we've said a number of times again this morning, this learner learns differently to other learners the same age. So they learn in a different way or a pace compared to what we would expect learners generally in that classroom. And what I've got on the red text on the right-hand side of the slide, there are kind of different categories of cognition and learning needs. So the first 3 are kind of categories of needs where the learner has needs or challenges right across their curriculum. So moderate learning difficulties, so maybe a couple of years behind where we would expect them to be in terms of chronological age. So maybe that 13-year-old who's working at the pace or stage of a 10-year-old, for example. Severe learning difficulties. Okay, those that gap in attainment or working is now a bit more defined. And then profound and multiple learning difficulties. So learners we saw like Jacob, for example, in the Escoladeri video, not only were there learning difficulties, but potentially other challenges, for example, being non-verbal, having impersonal care, toileting, health needs, in addition to those as well. Now, one category that we used to have in Wales, which we don't have anymore, which would have gone at the top of this list previously, I suppose, would have been general learning difficulties. In other words, those learners who were maybe 6 to 12 months behind their peers. So that person who's working at a pace that's a little bit slower than the majority of learners in their class. And maybe, we said last time, one of the reasons why the number of learners in Wales has dropped by nearly 50,000 over the last few years is because we don't count general learning differences or difficulties anymore. So some of those learners who would have been caught up in that category are no longer counted. So those first 3 categories then, challenges across the curriculum, and then we said there were more specific learning difficulties, and although they can impact across a learner everywhere, potentially their need or challenge is in a more specific area. So we said dyslexia, difficulty with words in particular, dyscalculia, difficulty with numbers, dyspraxia, difficulty with body coordination and movement, and dysgraphia, difficulty with handwriting or typing in particular. So more specific. So what we tend to have is learners who have one of these kind of dys needs tend to have what they call a spiky profile. In other words, the learner is very good at that, is quite good at that, struggles with this bit, rather than kind of struggling across all areas of the curriculum. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking shortly. I'm just going to spend a few minutes kind of setting you off on a task. And then I'm going to give you 15 minutes to have a go at doing this morning before we move on and think a little bit more about literacy and think a little bit more about labels. So we said then there were 4 different conditions, 4 different specific learning difficulties or disabilities or disorders, depending upon the definitions we use. Dyslexia with words, dyscalculia with number, dyspraxia body movement, and dysgraphia in terms of physical handwriting or typing. Now, in terms of these areas of need, what I'm hoping we'll see as we go through in terms of this is that there are all sorts of different cross-occurring challenges that we might see. So a learner who is dyslexic, for example, might really struggle with maths, not because they don't understand how numbers work, but because there's literacy involved in maths at times. Or potentially the challenge is working through a sum or a question where there's multiple different parts to it. We might see a learner who is dyscalculic, for example, so their main challenge is in relation to number, but they might also struggle with things like coordination, the difference between left and right, for example. That dyspraxic learner who potentially we would expect to see some more of those kind of physical challenges, we might see them struggling with challenges relating to speech, which impacts upon their reading and writing, for example. And then that dysgraphic learner, which is one which is very difficult to get a diagnosis of, might be struggling with handwriting for all sorts of different reasons. So, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to kind of work either individually or in small groups, depending upon what works best for you. And I'm going to ask you to pick one of these 4 different areas of need. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to come up with a kind of a fact sheet, which has got some visuals attached to it as well, hopefully. And in particular, I'd like your fact sheet to cover 5 things. So first off, what are some of the traits or characteristics that we would expect a learner diagnosed with your chosen need to show? So that dyslexic learner, what sort of challenges would we expect them to see? Second one is causes. Now, this is a little bit more difficult. We've said already we can't decide what the cause is of dyslexia, but it does seem to be something genetic. Now, that does seem to be the case with these other areas of need as well. However, there is a bit more debate about these in terms of what causes them. So some of these, for example, talk about the fact that it might be to do with different brain processing in the same way as we saw with dyslexia last week. In other cases, they say it's genetic, but actually we don't really know any more than that. And some of these talk about the fact that it might be linked to things like prenatal use of alcohol or drugs, for example, or being born prematurely. But again, the evidence is really sparse in terms of those. So again, first of all, what are the traits and characteristics? Secondly, what might be the causes? And I'd also like you, if you can, to find out a little bit of information about how common or how prevalent these needs are. Now, we said last week that dyslexia, depending upon what population we're looking at, is probably about 10% of the UK population, but that's a rough guess. Certain parts of the population, we tend to see that being higher. So the adult male prison population in the UK, for example, about 66% of all adult male prisoners show literacy challenges. Probably 50% of those are dyslexic. So what's the rough prevalence? A really difficult one to find an answer to is dysgraphia. I'd also like you to think a little bit about what support might look like. So a learner who is dysgraphic, what type of support might be beneficial for them to improve or help with their handwriting, for example? That learner who is dyscalculic, what support might they need in the classroom to help them understand number? And then the final thing I'd like you to think of, which is something that we don't tend to focus on as much, is are there any areas of strength noted in these conditions as well? So when we think about labels, as we've said before, very often we think about what the learner can't do or what the learner might struggle to do. Are there areas of strength noted with these as well? Now, we increasingly see in literature linked to dyslexia, talking about it being a superpower, for example, different strengths in relation to different ways of processing information. We've seen organisations like the FBI in America or MI5 in the UK, for example, actively recruiting dyslexic and autistic individuals because the way they think brings strengths, because they think differently to other people. So why wouldn't we want to exploit and build on those things? So again then, and I'll shut up and give you some time to do this, choosing one of those 4 DISs, what are the kind of common traits or characteristics? And hopefully what we'll see when people have had a chance to post these a little bit later on is that there is all sorts of commonality between them, which might explain why it's difficult for some of these to be diagnosed. So what are the common traits? What might be the causes? And how common might these areas be? So as we said, dyslexia at about 10%. The others is a little bit more vague. Dyscalculia at about 5% of the UK population. Probably more because we don't really understand what it is and it's very difficult to measure it. Dyspraxia, again, probably somewhere between 5 to 8% of the population. And then dysgraphia, the honest answer for this one is who knows. About 10 to 30% of all children at some point experience challenges with handwriting or learning to write. However, how much of that is related to dysgraphia is incredibly difficult to prove. Okay, so traits and characteristics, causes and prevalence, potential strategies to support the learner. So if you were going to be working with a dyspraxic pupil in the future, what sort of things in the classroom, what sort of support from you might be helpful for them? And then are there related strengths? So trying to move away from seeing labels just as being deficits or difficulties, are there good points related to those things as well? Okay, so rather than assigning people a particular area of need to look at, I'm going to give you the option to choose whichever one you want to look at. Hopefully people in the room will pick on different ones, and then in about 15 minutes time what we'll do is go back and look through what people have posted and look to see whether there are commonalities, whether there are things that are specific, for example. And I will ask some of you to feedback verbally as we go through this morning. So any questions before I set you off on that? I take that as no. I will come round and annoy you whilst you're doing that as well. So it's 10:20 now. If we aim to have posted what you've got by 10:35, potentially it would be nice to have some kind of images on there as well, and then we'll see what we've got and we will compare them. Okay. So I'll pause the recording at that point. Post what you've got so far. So really interesting discussions going around the room though in terms of which area of need people have chosen. Thinking about the prevalence, thinking about traits and characteristics, thinking about support needs, and then potentially in terms of strengths, maybe a little bit easier to find those in relation to dyslexia, maybe because there is more kind of awareness that there are strengths in terms of that. And then we'll kind of have a look at what people have posted. And then what I'm going to ask you to do once people have finished posting is to kind of take a look at what's on there and post some comments into that final column. So looking at what people post on dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia and dyspraxia, what are similar traits and characteristics, for example. So if we look at the dyslexia one, so you can see here, for example, so it's a learning difference. Now, we talked last week that there was different definitions. Some of these call it a difference, some call it a difficulty, some call it a disorder, some call it a disability. all those words are very different in their meaning and their connotations. If you have a learning difference, that sounds far different to having a learning disability. Okay, so it's a learning difference, impact upon reading, writing and spelling, and that's a key point we mentioned last week as well. Overall, there is no impact on intelligence. So you're not struggling to read, write and spell because you lack intelligence. Okay, key points. So difficulty with word recognition. So we said about this a bit last week and we pick it up again shortly. Challenges between linking sounds, phonemes to graphemes, letters. How do I write on paper or type on screen the sound that I want to say? Okay, bless you. Might be challenges in terms of reading, so it might take more time. If it takes us more time to read, that impact on things like our fluency, for example. If we are reading less fluently because it's taken us more time to understand the words, it impacts upon our understanding and our comprehension of what we're reading. Okay, challenges in terms of spelling, and this is a really key word that someone's put on here, can be inconsistent. In other words, you can spell that word today, but you can't spell it tomorrow. Or you've spelt the word 5 different ways on the same page of writing that you've done today. So it's inconsistent. Okay, so there's likely to be some kind of neurological basis. So we saw that with the kind of the brain scan last week. The brain works differently. Okay, not better, not worse, just differently. Not related to intelligence, varies from person to person. This is a key point as well. It's on a very wide spectrum, from very mild to very severe, and there's no cut-off points within that spectrum either. So we could have 2 dyslexic people in the room this morning, both of whom their severity of dyslexia could be incredibly different. Equally, the associated strengths and challenges can be unique to that individual as well. And then focusing a bit more on strengths, so strong visual thinking. So some of the others we'll look at shortly, maybe there are more challenges around spatial awareness. So dyslexia, that seems to be more of a strength, for example. Creativity, innovative problem solvers, good at big picture thinking. Okay, don't necessarily get bogged down in the smaller details of things, but can see the picture on a broader level. Practical learning, this I think is a good one. Potentially could be really good at oral literacy, being able to tell stories and being creative, although the challenge is actually getting those down or reading them off paper. And then potentially these learners might be resilient and adaptable and might have to be because of their experiences in the classroom. And then we've got some challenges as well, so reading, writing and spelling, slow processing. In other words, it takes the dyslexic brain longer potentially to carry out some tasks in terms of trying to access information that it's stored, for example. Challenges around memory, trouble with sequencing and organisation. Okay, we tend to see this quite often in preschool children, for example, with children who try and dress themselves but are trying to put things on in the wrong order. They've put their shoes on before they've put their socks on, for example. Okay, so struggling with the sequencing and order of tasks. Potentially we see frustration. Potentially this is the person in class who now starts misbehaving when there's a literacy task. This is the person who finds something else to do. This is the person who now needs to go to the bathroom as soon as the teacher said they're going to do some reading, for example. So maybe ways of avoiding challenges that they know are coming up. Okay, and then going on to the other one. Okay, so it's common. So as we said, it's probably somewhere between 10 to 20% of the population, depending upon what population we're looking at. However, that does vary between countries. So roughly 10% of people in the UK, for example. Nice bit there in terms of support. So early identification is helpful. However, we might see a little bit tomorrow that sometimes we do identify people too early and we actually misdiagnose people as being dyslexic when they aren't. So that can also be a challenge as well. And then the strengths related to creativity and problem solving. And then some more specific traits in terms of this one. So things like slow reading speed. So one of the things that dyslexic learners get quite often in school, for example, is extra time to do their GCSEs. So very often you can get 25% extra time. So in other words, an extra 15 minutes for every hour your exam is. And potentially that extra 25% of time is to help support you because it takes you longer to read the same information as others, or it takes you longer to write the same length of answer than others. Therefore, if you only had the same 1 hour, you would never get to finish what it was you were trying to do. Okay, dyscalculia then, thank you. So this one again, so it's a specific learning difficulty we've noted this time. So in particular in relation to numbers, but not just numbers, we've also got time, sequencing, we've got facts, we've got direction, for example. Similar traits to dyslexia in terms of memory and sequence and organisation. Seems to be less common. So the rates of prevalence do vary between where you look, but it's about 5%, they think, of the UK population. However, is that a true reflection? I don't know. Is that a reflection of what we know and what we identify rather than a true reflection of how common it is? It's a lifelong condition, so like dyslexia, you will always be dyscalculic, so it's not something that you grow out of. There are co-occurring, or sometimes you see the word comorbid difficulties. So if you are dyscalculic, you are more likely to be ADHD, you are more likely to have dyslexia, for example, at least on a statistical level, but not necessarily. Can lead to anxiety, in particular maths anxiety, which is a massive issue in the classroom in the UK currently. Okay, further symptoms then, so sequencing, following directions. Okay, so that person who you say to them, okay, you need to turn left and they've gone the wrong way, for example, telling the time can be a challenge. Going to the shop, figuring out how much money to hand over, figuring out whether the change you've got is appropriate, for example. Can be challenges around identifying and writing number. So the answer to a sum is 36. Well, I've got no idea what 36 means as a concept. Equally, I don't know how to write the symbols for the numbers 3 and 6. So all sorts of issues there. This is something, I think that's an interesting trait. Maybe this is that learner that we see who still counts on their fingers. Okay, now I'm not dyscalculic, I'm 51 years of age. Every now and again I do count on my fingers because it's easier. Okay, so learners who maybe are using tools that we would expect people to have grown out of when they're younger. However, there is that debate around why should we expect people to grow out of those? If it's helpful when you're in primary school to have things like number blocks or counters to help you with maths and counting and subtraction, why do we take those away from people when they get into secondary school? Okay, in terms of potential causes, so yes, it does seem to be genetic. I'm not quite sure, probably seems to be impacting the same areas of the brain as dyslexia did, in particular that parietal part of the brain that we'll look at again shortly. Some strategies, okay, multisensory instruction, and that's a really nice one that we'll focus on a bit in seminars tomorrow, really helpful for all of these areas. Okay, using multisensory ways to support teaching. And one of the things we do with learners that as they get older as well is take those multisensory things away. So if you can remember back when you were in primary school, you would have spent far more time reading aloud, for example. When you went to secondary school, you were expected to read in silence. Okay, so that's one sense that sound has been taken away from you as a support in the classroom when you're being taught. Doesn't particularly help. Okay, dyspraxia. Okay, so challenges in terms of planning, executing, carrying out physical movements. A few people mentioned the word clumsy when we were kind of going around the room earlier on, and that was a key characteristic that people used to pick up on. So that child who's always bumping into things, that child who's always falling over. And as we said earlier, in the 1970s, very informally known as clumsy child syndrome, for example. Challenges in terms of maybe fine motor skills, so the ability to hold a pen or a pencil appropriately, to pick up a knife and fork and manipulate those in an appropriate way. Balance and coordination, telling the time can be an issue, sequencing can be an issue. Again, co-occurring with ADHD and anxiety, for example. So potentially, this is a nice point, challenges in terms of how nerve cells transmit and process information between different parts of the body. Okay, and then that looks really nice. I apologise, I can't see that one particularly well, but words like motor skills, for example, really showing up in that one. And then the final one, again, we got physical signs like difficulty with general motor skills, for example. And then looking at dysgraphia. Okay, so this one is quite challenging to find information on, and it's quite challenging to get a diagnosis of, because it's very difficult to delineate where is the difference between somebody who's just got poor handwriting or whether it's as a result of a particular area of need. So in terms of prevalence, as we said, somewhere up to about 30% of all children struggle with handwriting, but how much of that is to do with dysgraphia is really open to debate, and potentially there are different types of dysgraphia as well, we don't quite know. So maybe people talk about there being dyslexic dysgraphia. So that person whose handwriting is challenging because they struggle to link the phoneme to the grapheme to write it with. Or is this person's handwriting, for example, where all the words kind of meld into one, there's a lack of spaces between letters and words, is that more to do with a spatial challenge? Okay, spatial awareness, people talked about being a challenge in relation to dyscalculia as well. Or is it something that's linked to dyspraxia and the challenges around fine and gross motor skills? So thank you very much for sharing those. Going through those, hopefully what you can see is that there's all sorts of characteristics that run right across those. So that learner who is dyslexic might have learned strategies to support their reading, but struggles with handwriting. That person who is dyslexic might struggle with following sums, but they don't have dyscalculia. That person who is dyspraxic might have challenges in terms of their speech and language, which impact upon their writing. So all sorts of crossovers between them. It's quite difficult potentially to delineate some of these challenges between one and another. So thank you very much for posting those. I'm going to carry on for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll stop for a quick break, if that's okay. I just wanted to kind of recap a couple of things from last week and then build on them a little bit more. So we said last week that learners who have a cognition and learning difficulty or difference or disability or disorder, depending upon your point of view, all seem to have challenges relating to attention and memory. And we talked about memory, thinking that there are different types of memory which impact upon different skills. So short-term memory, so following instructions in classrooms. You've had a conversation with someone, but you've forgotten what the last thing that person said to you was because you were trying to formulate an answer. You've read a page in a textbook, and by the time you've got to the end of the first paragraph, you've forgotten what it said at the start. So challenges around short-term memory. Challenges around working memory. So we see this sometimes in maths in particular when there are different parts or components to a sum that you might be working on. So you might be doing something like 26 times 45, for example. So you've done the first part of the sum, but you've now got lost and you've forgotten what the first part was that you've done, meaning you struggle to move on to the next bit. And potentially there might be challenges in relation to long-term memory, and in particular in terms of accessing those long-term memories. And we saw that on that slide last week, potentially those folders of information, which was kind of a very rough analogy, the learner being able to access those. Now, in terms of dyslexia, we said in terms of prevalence, countries that speak English seem to have the highest levels of prevalence, and that could be for all sorts of different reasons. So it could be there's more expertise and knowledge about dyslexia in those countries. It could be because the vast majority, if not all, of the dyslexia assessment tests that we use are written in English, but it could also be something to do with the language itself. So we have less people who are first language Welsh speakers in Wales being diagnosed with dyslexia than English speakers. They probably are dyslexic. However, because the Welsh language is easier in many respects than English, we don't tend to see the same challenges. And what we said, challenges with English, 40 sounds at least that we're using, phonemes. If you live in Newcastle or if you live in parts of London, for example, people tend to suggest that somewhere between 44 and 48 different sounds people use. But across the UK, it's roughly 40. We've only got 26 letters or graphemes to spell them. And as we saw last week when we looked at just the letter A, for example, and homophones, there were different ways of spelling the same sound. And we also said then English has got a lot of words in it. So there's about 500,000 words commonly used in English at any one time, compared to French, for example, which is about 90,000. And the words we have in the English language come from all other different languages that have got their own spelling rules and ways of doing things as well. We looked at this briefly last week. Again, apologies, this slide isn't any easier to read, but we talked about the fact that there were different definitions of dyslexia that said the same thing, perhaps in more complex ways. And this is the one that most schools in the UK would tend to use, which is the Rose Review definition. And this one, I think, is a really good one to use, in particular as a result of what it says at the bottom. So a good indication that a learner might be dyslexic is because they show the traits and characteristics despite the fact that they've been to school and despite the fact that they've been taught appropriately, whatever that means. So potentially we could have a learner who shows these traits because they've never been to school. Okay, it doesn't mean they're dyslexic. We looked at this diagram last week as well. We said that dyslexia was biological, seems to be something you're born with. As a result of that, it impacts upon how you process information. And because of that, we see characteristics in the classroom. So that person who's really good at giving answers verbally, but struggles to write them down. And we said potentially there were challenges in relation to the environment. So thinking about that in a bit more detail, we had these things on the slide. And then in terms of the environment, we were looking at things like how people are taught, what language they speak, for example. And people have looked to try and find whether there are all sorts of different other factors that might cause dyslexia. So one of the key things people have been looking at over the last 20 years, for example, has been to do with air pollution. And is there some link between pollution and dyslexia? And it doesn't seem to be. However, there does seem to be impacts between air pollution, for example, and children having learning difficulties. So children go into primary school in heavily polluted cities, for example, tend to do less well academically compared to children who don't. Now, is that because of air pollution? Is it because stereotypically those schools that are found in the most heavily polluted areas tend to be serving poorer parts of the community, for example? So there might be all sorts of interrelated challenges there. So people have tried for years to find an environmental link to dyslexia. We can't really find one, other than potentially the language and how people are taught. Okay, we said then dyslexia was genetic. I think those of you who'd posted on the others earlier as well had all said that for the other ones as well. So it seems to be something you're born with. In terms of dyslexia and dyscalculia in particular, it seems to be what they call a dysfunction of the left hemisphere of the brain. In other words, the left-hand side of the brain, which is where we process sounds and visual information, seems to be impacted. Potentially something that studies in Sweden and Cardiff have looked at is something called KIAA03119, which is a protein that's used to coat cells in eyes that process visual information. We saw this slide last week then, which talked about the fact that the neurotypical brain seemed to be using these 3 different areas when it was involved in reading, whilst the dyslexic or maybe neurodivergent brain was only able to use one of those. In other words, it didn't seem to be able to access those 2 stores of information. Those folders stored in pictures or visuals, and those folders stored in sounds, for example. So it was almost like the dyslexic brain in some cases is reading the word for the very first time every time they see it, because they can't access that store of information. So what we're going to do when we come back shortly then is start to think a little bit more about literacy and how dyslexia specifically impacts upon spelling and reading. And then we're going to move on to think a little bit more about arguments about the label, which might be a useful way to focus the assignment if you choose that one going forward. So it's 11:04 now. We'll stop for 10 minutes. So if we start back at about 11:15, and then we'll move on to think a little bit more about literacy. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming back after the break. So what we're going to do now then is move on and spend a little bit of time thinking about literacy, what some of the skills related to literacy include, and potentially how a learner with dyslexia or maybe one of the other specific learning differences can be impacted in terms of that. And we'll also think a little bit as well about sometimes how it's difficult to delineate between what might be kind of a general challenge that all children and learners face as they develop skills, and when does that become something that's more evident of something else. Okay, so when we think about literacy, for example, we normally talk about reading, writing and spelling, but increasingly we're starting to see importance placed on oracy as well, so in terms of speech and language. And in terms of some of these things, when we're thinking about literacy, there's all sorts of things that we need to know. None of these things we are born knowing, therefore we have to develop these as we go through education. And one of the key ones potentially relates to the alphabet. So we've said a few times, for example, these alphabetical letters, realistically, they don't mean anything themselves. They have been suggested as being the symbol that spells the particular sound. And as we said, we've only got 26 of these graphemes to spell 40-something phoneme sounds. So one of the first things that you would have learnt when you went to school or before you started school, for example, would have been the alphabet, the symbols we use to convey sounds. And there's all sorts of things that we need to know about the alphabet. And the alphabet is probably something that you haven't consciously thought about since you learnt it when you were younger. So we need to know, for example, that each of these 26 different graphemes or letters have names. Okay, we need to know that letters represent sounds. Might be worth knowing how many letters there are. Might be helpful to know what the sequence of the letters are. In particular, for children who find challenges with speech and language, knowing differences between consonants and vowels, for example, might be important, as the main difference between them is if you are pronouncing a vowel sound, then your airway is open when you pronounce that sound. If you are pronouncing a consonant, then some part of your airway is restricted when you make that sound. So if you compare, for example, I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but if you compared what's going on in your mouth, for example, in terms of tongue position, when you were saying the letter A compared to the letter B, for example, you will see your tongue is in a different position, which impacts upon that airflow when you're saying those sounds. And we also need to know, and this can be a challenge for some learners, that letters are upper and lowercase. So we can have capital letters and lowercase letters, but they represent the same sounds and the same names. And one of the things that's commonly done in primary school, for example, is we use the capital letters to teach names. So A with a capital A, but we use the lowercase letters when we're talking about sounds like A. So some learners potentially miss that link between capitals or lowercase being the same sound. Okay, so in terms of literacy, we need to know the letters, we need to know the graphemes that we use to spell sounds and convey meaning. Just going to spend a little bit of time then thinking about how children develop their spelling and develop their writing, and we'll also think a little bit about what people do when they're reading as well. So in terms of how people develop writing, there are all sorts of different theories, but this is one of the most common ones which is still used, although this is from 1978, which talks about the fact that as we learn to develop spelling, we go through 5 different stages. And these 5 different stages are called pre-communicative. Okay, so any of you who've spent time with very young children, for example, or preschool children, potentially they might be babbling away whilst they are moving a pen or a crayon across a piece of paper. There is some effort or process to try and communicate using that process, but no recognition of the sounds or how to spell them. So we have a pre-communicative stage. Secondly, as children then start to develop a little bit further, we might get into what some people call the pre-phonetic or some people call the semi-phonetic phase. In other words, we recognize some sounds in words, and when we start to spell them, we write some of those sounds down, but they're not all there. So on this table, I don't know how well you can see it, for example, but this is trying to show what somebody writing "I like dogs" might look like at each of these different stages. So that first one is kind of random letters and numbers on there. Somebody's written something down, they're trying to communicate a message or a meaning, but they don't have the skills as yet to link the sounds and the graphemes together. The semi-phonetic one, we've got some of the sounds. So we've got the I, we've got the L and K from like, and we've got dug from dogs. So part of the sounds are there. So the spelling isn't correct, but the spelling, potentially the sounds they are aware of, and it's definitely closer to what they're trying to spell than that one is. So there is more of a development. The phonetic phase then may be thinking about learners who are perhaps 6, 7 years of age. We're starting to see now learners spelling sounds far more phonetically. So still might not be quite right, still might not have all the letters in place, but the sounds that are written are closer to what it is they're trying to write. We then get into that transitional phase, so somewhere perhaps between the ages of 7, 8, 9, depending on the individual learner, where it's closer, and what they call this is transitional. So the spelling still might not be quite right, but we can definitely see that's closer to being "I like dogs" than that first one is, for example. And then when we get into the mature stage, which is again dependent upon learners somewhere from 9, 10, 11 years of age upwards, what we've got is that standard correct spelling. So all of us will go through those different stages of spelling as we are learning sounds and letters. Now, just to give you some examples of these aren't mine, I've got to be honest. I kind of found these on Google, but I thought these were quite useful representations of these different sounds. Now, what we've got here, I'm assuming, is quite a young learner. And what they've tried to communicate here, I don't know how well you can see it, is the ghost is scaring people. Now, looking at what they've written, I'm kind of guessing that this is somebody called Andrew, but I don't know. But what they've tried to communicate in that image is that phrase, the ghost is scaring people. Now, there's definitely an attempt to communicate there, but we wouldn't necessarily get from what's been written that was the message they were trying to convey. Second one, semi-phonetic. So this one, IMPSCR, is somebody trying to write I am playing soccer. Now, some of the sounds are there, some of the letters are appropriate. I think the picture that goes with it tells a bit more of the story. I'm assuming that's a goalpost. I'm not sure if that's someone with a big ponytail or whether that's somebody with one of those old-fashioned kind of wooden clackers people used to take to football matches, for example. But that I am sker is definitely closer to what they were trying to say compared to that. So we can see there's a development between those stages. The third one then, phonetic. Okay, I quite like the picture for this one. So this is somebody trying to say, I am picking flowers. Now we can see the flowers in the image. The letters are closer. I am picking flowers. Still isn't correct, but it's closer. So there's more information being shared in that one rather than that one, for example. And then we've got this one as a transitional stage. So we can see what it is they're meaning, although it's not spelt correctly. So I will miss you. I really don't want you to leave. I love you so much, but I hope you have a great time. Now, words there still aren't spelt correctly, but it's closer. And we can understand what it is they're trying to get across there. And some of those, I think, on some attempts are quite good. Want. Why isn't want spelt that way? Okay, it definitely does spell that sound. And then finally, mature stages is just somebody who's written kind of appropriately spelled. So all of us go through those different stages as we learn to spell. Potentially by the time we leave primary school, we should be in this stage. Maybe a marker or something like dyslexia is somebody who, as they get towards the end of primary school, are perhaps still at that, or maybe even that stage, for example. Okay, so when we learn to spell and write, we kind of need to know the alphabet, and we learn it in stages. Next thing I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes mentioning is what are we doing when we're reading? Now, schools in the UK tend to follow a number of different models in terms of how they teach reading. This is perhaps one of the most common ones, which is called the simple view of reading. At one point, schools used to use something called the searchlights method of reading, for example, asking children to kind of guess what words might be based from different clues that they can gather. So the simple view of reading says when we're reading, we are doing two separate but linked things. And sometimes, potentially, this might be an explanation as to why some learners who are dyslexic get missed in the classroom. So when we're reading, one of the things we have to do is to be able to decode the graphemes, the letters that are on the page. In other words, do we recognize the words and can we say the sounds out correctly? So that's one part of reading. So potentially we might have a learner in classroom who's been asked to read out a piece of text. They've been able to say the correct sounds. They've done one part of the reading task. The second part is, do we understand what those symbols and what those words are saying to us? So as an example, one of the last ever dyslexia assessments I did was with someone totally convinced that he was dyslexic. However, all the data said that he wasn't when I went back and analysed it. One of the things he had to do as part of his assessment was read 2 different pieces of text. Every single word, apart from things like and this and if, he said out incorrectly. When I did some verbal questioning with him afterwards, he got all of those answers correct. So not quite sure what was going on with him as a learner, for example, but what he said out loud when he was reading was totally different to what was on the page, but he understood everything perfectly. Okay, so when we're reading, we need to be able to decode, say out the sounds, but also understand what those sounds and what those words mean. And sometimes learners in schools get missed because we've heard them reading out loud. They've seemed to have said the right sound, therefore we've taken it to mean that they also understand what's going on as well. So, just going to ask you to do these 2 things in terms of reading, for example. I want you to see if you can read both these pieces of text appropriately. So the first one, I can't remember what language that is or what it actually says, but it's something I typed into Google Translate. Can you read that one in the blue text? So can you say it out? Can you decode the sounds? Do you understand what it means? The second one, now those words there are all in English, so probably a bit easier to read the red text. However, are we reading it appropriately? Do you understand the meaning that's in those words? Okay. So, being able to read effectively, you need to be able to say the sounds, you need to be able to understand what's going on. So as we said, the red text, we've all probably seen those words before. Fox, grape, grey, shoe, on land, whisper, title base, curly fleet with armadillo, pecan never ending. You can say that out. What the hell does that mean? No idea. The other one in the blue, now we've probably not come across this before. Can you say or attempt to say those words out? If you can, how do you know or how are you guessing what those sounds say? Okay, so you might be able to decode it. So testu, hausu, zeni, and iriaku, ahal, izango, for example. And kind of have a guess as to what those words sound like, but I have no idea what those words mean. So on one level, we can kind of read both of those, we can decode it, but if we don't understand the message behind it, then we're not necessarily reading fluently. Okay, next thing I want you to do then is to have a go at reading this particular piece of text. Now this is a really exciting story about Grumpy and Flonk, and the reason why I'm asking you to read this is there's a couple of things really. What you've got in this text are some words that are real, so you will have come across these words before, so you should know what these words sound like and what these mean. However, there are some nonsense or made-up words here as well. So you won't have seen these words before, but potentially, based on your literacy skills, your knowledge of letters, your knowledge of words, your knowledge of clues within that text, you may still be able to read and understand what that is saying. And what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is to kind of think about what is the information contained in that story, what is going on. And I'd also like you to think a little bit about how you've come to that answer. Okay, now I've used this text quite a few times. This is something they use in Australia when they train English teachers, for example, in terms of supporting children to learn to read. There's no right answer in terms of what you might get out of this, but maybe there are more common themes that people tend to pick up on, which might be as a result of some of the words that are in there or some of the kind of the grammatical clues that are in that text. Okay. So thinking about that text, Glompy is a bop, Flonk is a loff. Glompy clummed like flonk. Glompy and flonk are flommed. Rill had poved flonk to a donphy, but Low had not poved Glompy. The donphy is for lofts, flonk boff to Glompy. Rom reboop. Glompy was not clopy, then flonk was not clopy. Okay, so very exciting story. Now there's something that's going on in terms of that text. I'm going to put some questions up on the board in a second. I'm not going to ask you to write anything down in terms of these, but can you answer these questions? And then I'm going to ask you to kind of shout out what you think is going on in that text. And there's no right answer. But as I said, there tends to be certain themes that people come up with, and that might be as a result of particular clues that you might be picking up on. Because you know what, there's words on there that might look or sound like, or in the flow of a sentence might relate to a proper word that we might expect to be in there. Or maybe there's grammatical clues like the use of speech marks, for example, in there that you're picking up clues on as well. So, as I said, I'm not going to expect you to answer any of these questions. It will be a bit difficult in some cases. So, what are Glompy and flonk? Now, some of these are kind of quite straightforward, lower order finding type tasks. So, what are Glompy and flonk? So, if you went back, Glompy is a bop, flonk is a lof, but both of them are also flommed. Okay, so there's a number of different ways you can answer that question. Okay, who does Glompy clum like? What did flonk off to Glompy? So kind of standard questions you might ask somebody to find facts in a text. The next few questions then may be a little bit more difficult, a little bit more higher order, because they're asking you to try and work out what's going on, rather than just finding factual information. So why wasn't Glompy poved to the donphy? Why is flonk not clopy? All right, and then the final one, what do you think is going on in this story and why? Now, all of you will have read that, hopefully. Hopefully, you've kind of come up with something in your head which is telling you what is going on. All right, and what I'd like to do, if you're happy to do so for a moment or two, is just to kind of shout out what it is you think is going on and why you think that. Okay, so does anybody want to kind of start off? What might be happening in that text? Okay, and again, as I said, there's no right answer to this. There is no particular, this is definitely what's happening. Okay, anybody got any thoughts as to what might be going on? Okay, now the most common answer people tend to have told me over the last couple of years is maybe Glompy and Flonk are friends. Maybe one of them's been invited to go to a party and the other one's been told they're not allowed to go to that party because they're different in some way. And because of that, Glompy wasn't very happy because he'd not been invited or she'd not been invited. And then Flonk was not very happy about it either. Okay, so that's a good a guess as any. Did anybody have kind of similar thoughts? I can see a few people kind of nodding along as we went through. Okay, so in terms of similar thoughts, why might we have thought those things? So Glompy was not clopy, then Flonk was not clopy. Maybe that looks a little bit like Glompy wasn't happy and then Flonk wasn't happy. We can see there's some kind of speech going on in there in terms of those speech marks, for example. So whatever understanding you've gained from that text, you've based that on your understanding of how letters and sounds work, but also how text works as well. Okay, so there's all sorts of clues that you might have been picking up on. So maybe clopy sounds a little bit like happy, which is maybe where that comes from. Maybe someone has said that to someone which has upset the other person, and we know it's something that's been said because it's in speech marks. Okay, now when we're thinking about reading, there's all sorts of different places that we get information and clues from. Now again, I've got no idea what Glompy and Flonk are, but if we had something like that helped go with the text, for example, might have in visual images or pictures have been helpful. Maybe we could see that Glompy and Flonk were different types of creatures. Might that have helped? Somebody the other day told me in their head they talked about Glompy being a cat and Flonk being a dog, for example, and the dog not being invited to the cat's party because they were a dog. Okay, so there's all sorts of things that we could have. So all sorts of clues that people are using when they are reading. And potentially, as we get older and the text we engage with gets harder, what we do is we take those clues away. So apart from some kind of adult graphic novels, for example, we don't tend to see much in the ways of visual images or pictures when you think about novels or text for adults compared to novels or books for children. And if we think about very young children, for example, very often we start with picture books where there is no text at all, but people are able to understand and work out what's happening in the story based upon the images that are there. Okay. So we mentioned this last week. In terms of dyslexia, can't agree on what the cause might be different for every individual person, and each of these theories by itself doesn't explain everything. So we said there was the phonological deficit, the magnocellular deficit, and the cerebellar deficit. And when we talk about the phonological deficit, that person who might be struggling with reading because they can't process the sounds, or they can't process those sounds quickly enough. And what we might be looking for example, thinking about some of these things on the left-hand side of the slide, we might be looking at that learner, for example, who struggles to blend sounds together. So they might recognise that k, a, t as separate sounds, but might struggle to blend k, a, t to make the sound cat. Equally, we might see that in reverse in terms of segmentation. You can see the word hat or cat, but can't split it back into its different component sounds. We might have some learners who struggle with rhyming, who don't recognise that boy and toy and Roy, for example, are words that sound similar but are different. And potentially this is something, although I'm not dyslexic, I still really struggle with, is syllables. What is a syllable? Where do we split syllables up in words? And how do we recognise where those gaps in the words might be, for example? So it does tend to be some kind of phonological challenge. We mentioned briefly last time then the magnocellular challenge. So maybe dyslexic individuals struggle with processing visual information. We talked a little bit last time about dyslexic learners possibly not having a dominant eye. Some theories talk about dyslexic individuals as having binocular instability. In other words, your two eyes are processing different images, and the way in which they send that message back to the brain means it's not put together into a single image, which is why things might be fuzzy or move on a page, for example. We also said, so this is one of those teenage repellent alarms that I talked about last time, maybe dyslexic people might not physically hear some sounds. So sometimes that spelling, which might be incorrect, might be perfectly correct based upon what the learner has heard. And then very commonly, people have talked about this as strategies in schools, for example, put in text on different colour paper. So the worst combination we can have is black text on white paper, because that is the worst for causing eye strain. Eye strain causes headaches, which means we can't concentrate or pay attention to the text. So having different combinations of colours can be helpful. And then the final one is the cerebellar deficit. So potentially it takes dyslexic learners or dyspraxic learners or dyscalculic learners far more repetitions before things become remembered automatically. And Nicholson and Fawcett came up with what they called the square root rule. Now, this isn't a fact in any way at all, but this is kind of a nice analogy. What they suggested was that if it took somebody a certain amount of times to remember how to do a skill, then it would take the dyslexic individual the same number of times by its square root. So in other words, if it took you 100 repetitions to remember how to spell the word because, a dyslexic individual, the square root of 100 is 10. 10 times 100 is 1,000. It might take 1,000 repetitions for that automatic remembrance of that skill. Okay, however, that's just a rule of thumb. It's not a fact in any way at all, but it does seem to suggest that dyslexics individuals do take more repetitions before they're able to store and access those memories. Okay, so I'm just going to spend the final 5 minutes going through labels and the dyslexia label. Now, we've talked about labels quite a lot already. Some of you in the assignments I've seen so far have talked about labels and the impact of those. Dyslexia is another label, like inclusion, where there is all sorts of debate as to whether we should use it or not. And the main challenges are whether the dyslexic label is unhelpful and therefore we should stop giving it to people, or whether it's helpful because it informs things like support and intervention. Okay, and potentially, again, this depends on the individual and what type of school they go to and where they live and what kind of perspectives people have. So I'm just going to go through, there's a lot of information on these final few slides. I've only put this information up on there because it might be helpful if you follow this in terms of doing the next assignment on this one, rather than expecting you to read it all now. But as we said, potentially there is debate around whether dyslexia as a label is helpful or not. However, one of the challenges was lots of people, lots of theorists came up with arguments for and against. Yes, it's positive because we've identified your needs and we've put support in place. No, it's not positive because you think less of yourself, therefore it reduces your self-esteem. But until we got into the early 2000s, nobody really asked dyslexic people for their view on that. So over the next slides, or a few slides, I've just got some information about different studies with what they found. So some studies looked at interviewing dyslexic individuals. Some of these studies suggested that the label was helpful. So like Juliet, as an example of a student I mentioned last week, having that diagnosis of dyslexia she found really beneficial. She'd spent 40 years of her life thinking she was stupid because that's what she'd been told in school. At the age of 56, she found out she was dyslexic and it made her feel better about herself. I'm not stupid, I'm dyslexic. And that label helped her because it helped her understand the challenges she faced. Other studies tend to suggest that people who are given that label feel worse about themselves right across education. I'm dyslexic, it means I can't do that. I can't do that, that must mean that I'm stupid. Okay, so there's a range of different results that come out. Some people, like Juliet, talked about the fact that actually getting the label was helpful, but it was really hard until they got the label to explain the challenges they faced. Other studies looked at questionnairing people, and again, they had similar kind of results. Some of them talked about the fact that having the label helped them feel better about themselves. Others talked about the fact that it made them feel more stupid. They associated being dyslexic with being not able to do things. And then a number of studies, we'll look at one of these very shortly, again, talked about the fact that learners who were dyslexic, in some cases, getting the label not only made them feel worse about themselves in terms of literacy, but it made them feel worse about themselves right across education and different skills. So, missing out a few slides. So one of the studies I'm just going to mention in the final 2 minutes looked at a large cohort of students from across the UK. It looked at things like gender, how old they were, what level of parental education they had in their families, and they also tried to identify and set out discreetly whether they were dyslexic or not. And they asked them a number of different questions. So this one, for example, rating how good they were at English. And what we can see those dyslexic individuals rated themselves lower than their peers who are not dyslexic. They also asked them about maths. Okay, and we can see the dyslexic individuals rated themselves lower again. They also then asked them about, okay, so when you finish school, how likely is it you think that you're going to go on to university? And again, we can see far lower levels of those dyslexic individuals thinking that that might be their next step compared to their non-dyslexic peers. So it seemed to be impacting their kind of sense of self as a learner, but also thinking about impacting upon their future life chances and choices. They also asked parents, and what they found is parents of dyslexic children were far less of the opinion that their child was going to go on to university. And they also asked teachers. And teachers were also far less likely to say that that dyslexic learner was going to go on to university. So not only did that dyslexia label impact upon the individual, it also impacted upon how their parents and how their teachers thought of them as well. And potentially those things would have had an impact upon their life chances and life outcomes. Okay, so a quick summary of that research there. Just going to mention this briefly, and I'll pick it up in seminars tomorrow. Those of you doing the psychology route in particular might have looked at this last year, thinking about labelling theory. Okay, tend to suggest that if we give somebody a label, then they live up or down to that label. Okay, so that child, if you tell them they are naughty, you are more likely to see them as being naughty. They're more likely to display behaviours we see as naughty. We've mentioned this before briefly as well, self-fulfilling prophecy. We give that learner a label, like some of those dyslexic learners, for example. Do you know what? I can't do this, so what's the point in me trying? Because I didn't try, I failed in that exam. Well, that's what I thought was going to happen. Potentially that failure in the exam was as a result of not trying rather than because of the label that they'd been given. So potentially they had lived up or down to that label. We've mentioned this before as well in terms of teacher expectancy effect. Speaking to somebody on the open day the other Saturday, for example, somebody came in and she said, I don't know whether I should apply to this course because my head of sixth form has told me he knows that I'm not going to get any higher than 3 Ds. And my feeling was, what a pillock. He doesn't know that, he thinks that, but the fact that he thinks that and he's told that learner that, is that now more likely to happen because of her internalising the opinions that that person had of her. Okay. And then we've also mentioned this a little bit as well when we talked about teaching assistants and whether they support learned helplessness, for example. I've put some links to other readings. These ones are quite nice. If anyone's interested in this, if you ever see anything by Neil Alexander Pass, I think he's really interesting in terms of dyslexia. He was somebody who was severely dyslexic, and he said his life was changed. He was about to leave school. One of his teachers told him he was really good at art and he should stay on and go into art and design, which he did. And then he went on, he's now got a PhD in dyslexia, and he teaches dyslexia specifically as a subject based on his own experiences. Just going to mention this briefly, I'll pick up on this again tomorrow. I did mention to one of the groups, this is a job advert from a few years ago, thinking about strengths, and this was a job advert that was banned because it was seen as being discriminatory. So this was for a public relations firm and called The Garage, and their advert was banned because it said, if Steve Jobs was an agency, what would it look like? We are looking for talented thinkers who think differently to join us. We require people with a unique mind, so only dyslexics like Steve should apply. So very much trying to focus on the strengths and positives of dyslexia. However, this advert was banned because it was seen as being discriminatory because it told non-dyslexic people they were not allowed to apply. Okay. I'm not going to ask you to do that one today. And then finally, thinking about what we've done today, This could fit in well, for example, if you're going to choose that essay choice, thinking about labels. Next week, we're going to move on to think about autism, which will focus on that assignment in particular. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening this morning. Have a lovely weekend when it comes. Stay safe in the weather if any of you have got snow near where you live.